Jesus is better than angels. He's better than the prophets. He's better than Moses. He's better than Joshua. It's not to say any of those things are bad. I need to go up. Sorry, I'm going up. Well, now this just feels at home. Although I feel like the Bible study just got about 10 minutes longer. For some reason, when I get behind the podium, it just gets longer. Now, we're having some camera issues this morning. All right. So, it's not to say that there's anything inherently wrong with Moses, Joshua, angels, prophets. Nothing. It's just that Jesus is better. That's the theme of everything that the Hebrews author is alluding to. And there's one reality that he gives that would shake the Hebrew Christians to their very core. Jesus is better than the high priest. That to them would have blown their mind, because to them the high priest was everything. And so the emphasis of this is don't be guilty of settling for less than the best. Now, the Hebrew Christians were struggling with a few different aspects of this, and we know they were wanting to revert back to a level of Judaism, which is why chapter 5 closes with the call for maturity. It says, listen, you should be by now on the meat of the Word, and yet what does he say? You still need the milk. You're still basically being bottle-fed the milk. Not only that, a sign of Christian maturity is you should be teaching others, and you still need to learn the elementary things. Then in chapter 6, you get the bigger issue at hand, and that's the warning to those about falling away. If you fall away, not fall. Now, question, is there a difference in falling and falling away? I want to make that point. This isn't part of the lesson. This is bonus material, we'll call it. There's a big difference in falling and falling away. We all fall. Every one of us fall from time to time. He says, listen, do not fall away, because if you fall away from Christ, then what salvation is there for you? That's the point of this. If you leave Jesus, there's no hope of salvation, because there is no salvation apart from Jesus. So the warning here is about falling away. And while it sounds so dark and it sounds so negative, verse 9 of chapter 6, all of a sudden it's kind of doing this and this, and it takes a big shot up. All of a sudden you get more into encouragement, uplifting, and he says, but beloved, we're confident of things better concerning you. Like, though we speak to you in this manner, we're confident. In other words, don't be discouraged. God's not unjust. Have faith. Stay diligent. God sees you. He sees your works. And so you get this shift now towards encouragement. And he says, don't become sluggish, which is a way of saying don't be lazy, but imitate those through faith and patience inherit their promises. Now, if you think of someone who just demonstrates patience through faith, who comes to mind? Now, I know this is odd with me up here now this morning, but speak. Who comes to mind when you think of patience and waiting to, what was that? It's like you've studied this before. I'll tell you what. Well, then you ought to come teach this and I'll just sit. No, Abraham, that's exactly right. Who better can you think of when it comes to patience than Abraham? Because Abraham's called to leave Ur of the Chaldees. He's going, trusting the promise. He's told he's going to have a child. Do you know how long he waits before he has that child after the promise is given? 2.5 decades. 25 years he waits. Then he has the child, and then he says, hey, go sacrifice that child. So it's all about trusting in the promise, which is why Abraham is thought of in such high regards as the father of the faithful. He's actually thought in such high regard by Jews that he's second, Messianic Jews I should say, he's second in thought only to Jesus Christ. Because he had that kind of faith that God's promise will come to pass in His timing. Now that's the part we don't like, in His timing. So the call is don't fall away. Don't get lazy in your faith because God's promises are sure. Now he gets to the why. Because now we're getting into our lesson this morning. He gets to the why. Why is salvation sure in God's plan of redemption? Jesus Christ. That's why. That's where the writer has been building to now with a title being given to Jesus Christ. So notice the end of chapter 6, 19 and 20, verses 19 and 20. This hope, there's the word, this hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters the presence behind the veil, where the forerunner has entered for us, here it is, even Jesus, having become high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So understand, to understand this promise, and why we're going to do good to cover these 10 verses that I've got this morning, to understand the promise, you have to understand why Melchizedek is so extremely significant in Scripture. Remember what salvation was like for the Jews, and that'll kind of help get your mind in the right place. Everything to the Jews in worship centered around one thing, right? If you were going to worship God, where did you go as a Jew in the Old Testament? You had to go to the tabernacle, then later on you went to the temple. Right? You had to be in the temple. It was always about the temple. You had the outer courts, the innermost part of the temple, then it was separated, then you had the holiest of holies. Right? Guess where none of us in this room could go? We couldn't even go into the inner parts of the temple, much less the holiest of holies. And so the priests themselves couldn't go behind the veil to the holiest of holies. Only the high priest could, because behind that veil was the Ark of the Covenant. And God, well, the Bible tells us, God had said that He would dwell with them between the cherubim, the wings. That's the mercy seat. To be in the holiest of holies was to be in the presence of God. And do you remember how often they could go behind the veil to the Ark of the Covenant, the high priest? Once a year. What day? Now you said it all confidently. Now what's the day? Keep going. I can't believe you hadn't answered one yet. We went through all this. You got a lot more coming. The Day of Atonement. Because they went behind the veil and they sprinkled blood on the mercy seat. That was the Day of Atonement. Today, you hear it's called Yom Kippur. They call it the Holy Day. It's the Day of Atonement. And the high priest would go and he would do that. And what he's doing is he's making this sacrifice, this redemption moment of sprinkling blood so that God would forgive sins. Well, guess who else was included? If He's doing that for all people, guess who's included in that? The high priest. The high priest is having to do that too. But then if you remember, during the crucifixion of Jesus Christ on the cross, there was a great earthquake. And something inside the temple that is so monumental to our faith today happens. What was it? You whisper. What was it? The veil is torn. Now, the Bible, again, makes sure to let us know that not only was the veil torn, it was torn in a specific direction. Top to bottom. And it tells us that so none of us think, and we don't walk around going, well, some guy, probably about as strong as I am, walked in, because you have to have strength, Jason, would walk in and grab it from the bottom and just rip it, bottom to top. You don't want anybody thinking that. The Bible makes sure to let us know it was torn from top down. The veil that separated the holy and the holiest of holies is now removed, right? But you think, why would God do something like this? And then again, the question is, what in the world does that have to do with Melchizedek? Well, the answer is actually simple. Everything. You would have zero chance today of going before the presence of God unless that barrier between man and God had been removed. That veil represented something a whole lot more significant than just a veil. And so unless that separation was removed, it wouldn't be possible. And that's what made it possible for us today to have access to God. That's where our hope comes from, which is what the Hebrew writer calls there in those last couple of verses, the anchor of our soul. The anchor. What makes us immovable and steadfast is that sacrifice. But here's the how. That's the why. Here's the how. Jesus having become high priest forever. Do you see that at the end of that phrase, the end of that verse? And yet now we've got a glaring problem. Jesus is not a Levite, which means he could not be a priest. Not according to the law. And to claim to be a priest outside the law would have been sin. Unless there is a greater priesthood, something greater than the Levites. But to say greater than the Levites, who are you really now saying you're greater than? Because where did the Levites come from? We think of the Levites just as the Levites. Think about genealogy. Aaron, Keep going. We got to get all the way back. Jacob, keep going. We're almost there. Jacob to Isaac, Isaac to Abraham. So now you're not just saying that you've got to have somebody better than the Levitical tribe. Now you're saying you've got to have somebody even higher than Abraham. And so, I mean, this is significant. This is like groundbreaking, earth-shaking stuff to them because everything for them centered on the Levitical tribe, the priest, and Abraham. This is why we are introduced to Melchizedek. This is why Melchizedek is so significant. It's through his order that Jesus is our perpetual high priest forever. And so all of Hebrews chapter 7 centers around Melchizedek. And so there's so much mystery involved with Melchizedek that leads to so many ideas of who he is. Where did he come from? Is he a man? Is this a theophany? Just lots and lots of questions. And we'll get a lot more into that here in just a moment. But I want you to understand this. You have to realize who Melchizedek is in order to understand the priesthood of Jesus Christ. So I say, what does Melchizedek have to do with this? Everything. Everything. So let's get into chapter 7. We're actually ahead of time. I said 20 minutes. We're 14 minutes. We're going to do okay today, I think. Chapter 7, verse 1. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and then blessed him. All right, now hold up there before we go any further. We're going to make an effort now to stop and address the question, who is Melchizedek? Before the book of Hebrews, Melchizedek is only mentioned in the Bible 2 other times. Genesis chapter 14, he gets a whopping 3 verses, and in Psalm 110, he gets a whole 1 verse. Really, it's Genesis chapter 14 that sets the stage for us in understanding who Melchizedek is. We don't have time to go through the lesson this morning of all of chapter 14, or we'd never get through Hebrews. But basically, in a nutshell version of this, Lot, who's Abraham's nephew, is living in Sodom. He gets captured. There's a war there. You've got this group of pagan kings. One of the king leaders is Chedorlaomer. He comes in and they overthrow Sodom and they haul off the people. They haul off all their possessions. One escapes and he goes and he gets to Abram at this time, and he tells him what's happening. And so Abram, he takes 318 men and they chase down the army. Abraham defeats the army. He frees the people, recovers their belongings. He starts heading back home. And when he's heading back home is when he meets Melchizedek. And so in Genesis 14, we're going to look at just these 3 verses. Genesis 14. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tithe of all. So that's the introduction to Melchizedek, Genesis chapter 14. But now we're going to go through the painstaking detail of trying to figure out who Melchizedek is. There are 2 main thoughts as to who Melchizedek is. 3 in some circles, depending on how you look at it, because there was a Rabbi Ishmael in 135 BC who tried to make the comparison and say that Melchizedek is actually Shem, Noah's son. And so you've kind of got that off track over here, where they'll say, well, he's Shem. And listen, as crazy as it sounds, it's not impossible. Shem, the Bible tells us in Genesis 11 that Shem lived to be 600 years old. You're talking 500 years difference between the flood and Abraham. So it's not impossible, but highly unlikely. Now, the 2 real thoughts as far as who Melchizedek is, first off, either he is a historical figure, a man that lived in Abraham's day who was a type of Christ. And that type of Christ phrase is used for really a few people, that basically was someone that characterized a certain aspect of Jesus Christ. Some part of his life. Adam is a type of Christ. Jonah, Joshua, Melchizedek, these are all types of Christ because of some characteristic. And with Melchizedek, there's actually several you're going to see, and you can even make the argument in that, and a lot of people do this, that Melchizedek brought Abraham bread and wine. Bread and wine. If we really put our heads together and think hard, what similarity do you think people try to draw that as a comparison to? The Lord's Supper. Now, the other main argument with Melchizedek is that he is a Christophany or a theophany, however you like to say it, which is a fancy way of saying that this is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. God in the flesh. And a lot of this comes because the passage says he has no beginning, he has no end, he has no mother, he has no father. Now, while I don't agree with this point, I certainly see how this argument could be made. But remember, this has happened with the Lord before. Remember when Abram is sitting in his tent before Sodom is going to be destroyed, who does Abram see walking up to him? 3 men, right? 3 men. Who are the 3 men? One is the Lord, and 2 are angels. So this isn't the first time this has happened, is the whole point there. It wouldn't be the first time. So you can certainly understand the arguments behind both of these points. The reason I wholeheartedly believe that Melchizedek is indeed a historical figure is because the Bible makes the effort to tie him specifically to a historical place. It doesn't just say this random guy came out of nowhere, and we don't know where he's from, we know nothing about him, and he just showed up and then he's gone. Well, no. The Bible tells us that he is the king of a real city. He's the king of Salem, which is the abbreviated version of Jerusalem. Now, to be fair, there's another Salem in the Bible, which had another name, Shechem. But Josephus and many others make the argument that it's clearly describing Jerusalem. Now, and we're going to get more into this, but what's fascinating to me here is what specifically is said about Melchizedek, which is why I keep telling you how important this is. Now, in the days of Jesus, all things religion, who ruled? Who was in charge? All things religion? The high priest. Really, the priesthood by and large, right? They were in charge of everything. That's why the scribes, the Pharisees, that's why they have the power they do. So when we think priests, we think Levites. But, I'm going to ask you a question. Bob, you can't answer this because you and I already talked about this. Take a wild guess at who the very first priest mentioned in the Bible is. Don't you answer either. We already talked about it. Somebody wasn't in my class. I'm glad somebody in my class is going to try to answer that. Go ahead, Brady. You do it, Brady. Melchizedek. Melchizedek. I was messing with you. Melchizedek. See how you did that, Brian? So the first priest ever mentioned in the Bible has nothing to do with the Levites. It's actually Melchizedek, oh, by the way, by well over 500 years before the Levitical tribe ever even comes to even be a thought. Now, remember, the Levitical priesthood does not start until the wilderness, right? A lot of people either don't remember this, aren't familiar with this, so a little bit of a history lesson. Moses is up on Mount Sinai, and he's receiving the 10 Commandments, right? He's up there, he's in the presence of God, and unbeknownst to him, the people are at the base of the mountain. They're talking to Aaron. Aaron, Moses spent 40 days. We need to make us a god. They take their jewelry, and they make the fire. You remember what Aaron says? His argument is, I didn't really do it. We threw the gold here, and then poof, out popped the golden calf. Right? That was his argument. So they come to Aaron. Aaron obliged. They make this image, their God. Now the question for you, in the Bible, doesn't God always refer to Israel as His people? Yes, right? You always hear Israel called His people. But in Exodus 32, who does God say they are? The Israel. Who does He say Israel is? He's talking to Moses, and God, of course, God knows what's happening. He tells Moses, Moses, your people are corrupt and they're stiff-necked. And no, he didn't say my people. He said your people are corrupt and stiff-necked. And God's about to punish them. Moses makes intercession, pleads with God. Moses takes off back down the mountain. Halfway down the mountain, he meets up with a person that went up with him. Bonus points if you know who that is. Come on, you got this. Joshua, thank you. And when he gets to Joshua, Joshua says, it sounds like the sound of war down there. Of course, Moses knows what it is. So they hit the base of the mountain. He sees what they're doing. Moses gets mad. He basically throws the stones down. He breaks them. He takes the golden calves. He grinds them up, makes the people drink the mixture of water and the golden calf. But then this is where this comes from. He tells them, separate yourself. If you believe in the Lord, you come to me. If you don't, so be it. And here's the part, the history lesson for you in this. Only the Levites went to Moses. They're the only ones that separated themselves. And so then Moses tells the Levites, take up your swords. They go throughout their people. They kill 3,000. The Levites are going to be chosen as the priestly tribe. Aaron is going to be the first high priest. And so from that point on, religion really shifts more and more, and not really through God's design, just people, natural, the way people do things. The emphasis shifts more and more. There's like more and more prominence coming to the high priest and to the priesthood. And so you've got a priest named first long before that ever happened. Before Levite was ever, what do they call that? What do you call that when a genealogy, long before there's ever a thought, not a thought in your eye, a twinkle in your eye, or I can't remember what it was. Long, spark, I don't know, whatever it was. Melchizedek was priest long before Levi was ever even thought of. We'll just go with that. So Melchizedek is named in the Bible as a priest of the Most High God. Now it's not just that. Notice what verse 2 says back in Hebrews 7. To whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being translated King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, meaning King of Peace. So now you get more history on Melchizedek. Melchizedek's name is translated King of Righteousness. Melech, King, Zedek, righteousness, King of righteousness. Literal translation. And we should understand that because when you think of righteousness, by the time you get to the New Testament, righteousness is encompassed in one word. Who's the embodiment of righteousness? Jesus Christ. That's right. So we understand that correlation. Then he also tells us that he's the King of Salem. Salem is from the Hebrew root word shalom, which is King of Peace. Isaiah 6 gives us a description, a title, if you will, of Jesus Christ in the Messianic prophecy. He is the Prince of Peace. So all of this is making this comparison to Melchizedek as a type of Christ. Now, this is interesting to me also. Everything about Melchizedek has always fascinated me. Melchizedek is listed here as two things in the verse. What two things are they? He's a priest and a king. Priest and king. Who else in the Bible can make that claim? Well, what about Saul? Saul was a king, and then Saul also, did he make sacrifices? He wasn't supposed to. Now he did, but he wasn't supposed to. And because he did, do you remember as soon as he finishes making that sacrifice, what happens? Samuel comes, you couldn't draw it up any better than that. As soon as he finished, Samuel comes walking on, what did you do? What have you done? So he wasn't supposed to. What about Uzziah? He's king. He goes into the temple and he grabs the lamp. What happens to him as soon as he does? He gets struck with leprosy. So no, y'all all said it correctly. The only example in the Bible, only authorized example in the Bible, of both a priest and a king is Jesus Christ. And in fact, Jesus has the only unique moniker in the Bible, because not only is it priest and king, there's one more with Jesus. What'd you say? Well, Savior. Really, I shouldn't say that because there's about 50 that are Jesus. Lord, Savior, Redeemer, all we could go all of them. But Jesus is the only one in the Bible that could carry all three, prophet, priest, and king. He's the only one that could do it. No one else could. And so the links here, they're growing and growing and growing, and we're not done yet in how Melchizedek is a type of Christ. So verse 3, and verse 3 is where the confusion really starts to come in. Verse 3, in describing Melchizedek, says he's without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. Your translation may say perpetually. Now again, this is where people get thrown from the loop. So what do you think it means? So if you hear, just thinking naturally about things, if you hear that someone does not have father or mother, beginning or end, what do you naturally think? You have to think God, right? You got to think, do what? Still have a mother and father. Right, you got to raise, just like in our class, raise your hand to talk from now on. So you think miracle, miraculous. You think God. You think something kind of like I don't know, like a shooting star. You just came out of nowhere. There it is, and then it's gone, and you have no idea where it came from, where it went. You don't know anything about it. This verse is what leads so many to believe that Melchizedek was a theophany, that this is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. Because it says he's made like the Son of God. He remains a priest continually or perpetually. And what you actually have here is God's brilliance through inspiration, because He gives us we get the Word through inspiration. And what He's actually saying is there's no genealogy recorded. We're not told anything about where He came from. We're not told when He died. And if you're not told when He was born or when He died, what's the imagery you're left with? He wasn't. We don't know. He wasn't born. Did He die? If He's a man, sure He did. Do you know when He died? No. Yes, sir.
What happened with the second coming of Christ?
What do you mean what happened with second coming? I don't understand the question.
He died for all of us.
Hmm?
He's supposed to come back the second time. Well, according to this, he's been a precursor of him that's already been here. So what happens to that in the Bible where it's his second coming?
Yeah, but keep in mind, too, because by that, he would already be on like 4 or 5. Because He's already come, but now when did He come specifically as God in the flesh? And then when was His ministry? When was His king? Like, you got to go through when He appeared for a purpose in the Old Testament versus when did He actually come and take on flesh in His life through His ministry and then say, when I come back. That's the moment that establishes that second coming. But before that, we know that, because then it wasn't only that, granted He wasn't in the flesh at this point, but even when Joshua, before they take Jericho, he walks out and he sees the angel, capital A, capital L, angel of the Lord, standing in front of Jericho holding a sword in his hand. I mean,
Jesus was there when Adam was presented.
Yep.
Jesus was there when the Israelites, with the cloud and the fire. Jesus was there when Abraham, the 3 people that came to visit Abraham, one of them was Jesus.
Mhm.
And Jesus was on the earth when He wanted to be on the earth.
The difference comes in, because there are several, and the difference, and again, some of this is, we almost get confused when you say God and Lord. We try to separate them, but pillar by day, fire by night, we say God. God created the heavens and earth, we say God. But what do you learn in the New Testament specific to who actually created the heavens and the earth? Jesus did. Now, we say God, but again, that's because He is God. And so we sometimes struggle in differentiating the two. But that second coming all keys off of when He came and stayed and took on flesh and established His ministry. Then He starts talking about the second coming from that moment on. And see, and that's actually why I don't believe Melchizedek could have been a theophany. Because understand what that would mean. If Melchizedek was Jesus in the flesh, who was also king of Salem, guess what that meant? Can a king of an actual place just appear one day and disappear the next day? I mean, you're king of Salem. You've been there before, apparently. You got to go back and finish reigning over there. That has nothing to do with the Israelites, has nothing to do with Abraham, other than this moment with Melchizedek. And so he would now be tied to some kingdom over here that we have no record of. Which is why I don't believe this had anything, it was an actual theophany. I think he's a very literal person tied to a literal place. So you get this statement, though, that He's made like the Son of God. He remains a priest continually. And again, it's brilliance and inspiration in telling us that He has no genealogy recorded. We're just not told. It's not that He doesn't have a mother and father. If you're born and you're not Adam or Eve, guess what you have? You have a mother and father. And so, if He wasn't born, what it says is as if He wasn't born. But in the flesh, we know that He had to be. It's as if He never died because it's not recorded. So that's really what this means. By the words of the Bible, in fact, if He never died, if it's never recorded for us that He died, and He's saying that He's made like the Son of God a priest continually, what then is the illusion that we're given about Melchizedek? Is he still alive today? He could be. We're not told now we know, in the flesh, he's not alive. But you're told it doesn't end, and that's only because he's a type of Christ. He's tying that into Jesus Christ, who's one that is never going to die. And so that's the comparison that's actually made, that it's not that he literally did not die. It's not recorded for us that he died. Yes?
Just like it's not told to us when Jesus was born, what day he was born on, or anything like that. It's not important. When Melchizedek,
Say Kedalemir a few times.
it's not important when he was born or when he died. The importance is life.
I mean, I would always be careful saying it's not important. Because, the angels rejoiced. Everybody rejoiced when he was born. I say everybody. Herod didn't rejoice, but the angels in the field are rejoicing. So, I know what you mean. I'm not... the reason why, by and large, especially churches have made almost too big of a deal about Christmas. And there's nothing wrong with celebrating the birth of Christ. It's a monumental occasion. God took on flesh. That's a pretty big moment. The plan of redemption took effect right there. He came to the earth. He couldn't die if he wasn't born. But the emphasis he always puts towards is his death, burial, and resurrection. That's what he points towards. And then, of course, his ascension, because in that the Holy Spirit comes and his kingdom is then kicked off in full blast on the earth. So I do know what you meant, but you're right. We're not told when that is. So because Melchizedek's life was seemingly endless, without beginning, without end, his priesthood is seemingly endless. That's the comparison he's making here. It's really tying back into his priesthood. He's made like the Son of God, who always was, always will be, no beginning, no end. That's really what this is about. Melchizedek was a man with a genealogy. We don't have it. And so that's the problem I have essentially with the idea of a Christophany, is you now have Christ in flesh before he was born to the Virgin Mary, who would have to go rule in some kingdom that has nothing to do with God's people.
The Bible talks about sons of God, and then it talks about Jesus being God's only begotten Son. Begotten would be born of a woman, I would think. So he's the only one that allowed himself to come down to earth, be like man, and be born of a woman.
Well, yes, but it also ties into something else too when it talks about just why Jesus says he carries the moniker Son of God, right? Well, now you're saying his godhood had a beginning. Well, but it didn't. When it says he's the only begotten, and it's the same statement tied to Son of God, it means that the natures are the same. You've tied their natures together. When he says that, that he takes that moniker Son of God, that's putting him and God on the exact same level. He is in all likeness God, which is, of course, what you get when you get to Colossians 1, and you start getting a lot of that phraseology. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He's the mirror, the reflection, the image of the invisible. And so, begotten does point to those two events, that he was born. Now, the sons of God, when you get into, and we went through this in painstaking detail, I feel like, we were going through the book of Genesis, or not book of Genesis, through our angel study. That sons of God, and then you get to the Nephilim and all this, they say, well, that was a creation of God, is what they're getting towards. But I do know what you mean with the begotten. So, any other questions on anything we've talked about so far? I haven't stopped and asked for questions. I am sorry about that. I got up here and I just got confused on where I was. Now y'all are quiet? Huh? Just lost? Is that what you just said? Oh, we're not going to finish. That's cute. We're not going to finish. We were never going to finish when we started. All right, let's go and get to verse 4. Now consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. And indeed, those who are the sons of Levi, who receive the priesthood, have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law, that is, from their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. So, tithing. I'm going to start preaching now about giving money. No, it's not. So tithing is a big part of the Mosaic law, right? The people would come, they would give money to the Lord. 1/10 of everything went to the Lord. This was essentially to be used for the priests to continually carry out their functions. But notice again how verse 4 is phrased. All right? Now consider how great was Abraham that he gave him a tithe of all. And the phrase literally means a tenth of the best of the spoils, which meant Abraham recognized Melchizedek as greater, as a priest of God. Now, here's the point really being made, because again, everything religion flows through the Levitical tribe, through the priesthood. By the time you get to the rest of the Old Testament, New Testament, everything flows through the Levitical tribe. The priests receive a tithe from the people per God's commands. The Levites are the great-great-grandsons of Abraham, or great-great-great-grandsons of Abraham. Oh, and by the way, your great-great-grandfather recognized Melchizedek as greater and paid tithes to him. That's the point. The father of the faithful recognized Melchizedek and honored him as being blessed as a priest of the Most High God. Verse 6, but he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. Now beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. All right, so understand this, and I do apologize, we are speeding up quite a bit. So understand what this means here. The lesser never blesses the greater. Very basic principle when you get the Bible. The lesser never blesses the greater. The greater always blesses the lesser. So Abraham gave a tenth, but what is Melchizedek already done? He's already blessed Abraham. He brought the bread and wine. He says, blessed are you, Abraham, of the Most High God. So I mean, he's already blessed Abraham by someone greater than he is, because the greater blesses the lesser. Which is, again, really saying something when you think about who the lesser is, because by and large, who the lesser is in this statement is considered by most to be the greater of all, of Abraham next to Jesus. So to the Jews, Abraham's even higher than David. He's the guy, right? Now verse 8 I want to get to, because 8's another one that's kind of confusing. Verse 8, here mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives. What in the world does that mean? Here mortal men receive tithes. Now when you just hear that says mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, well now what are you being enticed to think? That he's immortal, right? But what did his genealogy just tell us? We don't know in the sense of his genealogy, he is. We don't know when he was born. But now listen again, let's really understand what verse 8 says though. If you look at the King James, for instance, it says, and here men that die receive tithes, but there one of whom it is witnessed that he liveth. So again, what he's doing is he's tying this back into the genealogy statement that, the Levitical priests, they tracked their priestly lines through great detail. You knew when they were born, you knew when they were died, you knew of what lineage you were, and you had to do that so that you knew, were you in line to be a high priest? Were you in line to be a priest, period? They knew when the priests were born. That is, of course, until AD 70, when the temple was destroyed. Now they don't know, which is why we don't have any high priests today. And guess what the end was for all the Levitical priests that received tithes throughout history? Guess what their end was? They all died. Every one of them died. They're all dead. The Hebrews author calls them mortal because they died. The comparison, once again, is to Melchizedek, who lives. I mean, how in the world can Melchizedek be alive? Well, he's not in the flesh, but because his genealogy is not recorded, he was made like the Son of God, in that he would appear as having neither birth nor death, beginning nor end, and his priesthood then continues even to this day. And so, you then come to verses 9, and really we'll go ahead and bring in verse 10 also. This is the point that the Jews would not like whatsoever. And again, these are Hebrew Christians flirting with Judaism once again. This is still their old mindset that they're trying to get away from. And verse 9 says, even Levi, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak. For he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. So before Aaron, the first high priest, was even a pupil in his great-great-grandfather's eye, great-great-great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather, it's 3? It doesn't matter. They were paying tithes to the greater priesthood. And again, when you get to the New Testament and you look at the Pharisees, how highly do they think of themselves? They thought of themselves as, they're it, right? I mean, they're the priest. And he says, well, understand this. Long before you paid tithes. Well, when did I pay? You paid tithes in that Abraham paid tithes. So, what were the priests, what was their response to Jesus Christ when he was throughout his ministry and his life? Did they ever accept him as high priest? No. In fact, they're going to accuse him of blaspheming as he's working by the power of the devil. They're everything but accepting him. And now the writer here says, okay, but Jesus is the high priest according to Melchizedek, of whom you paid tithes to. Like, well, we didn't pay tithes. Yeah, you did. Because your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, all the way back from the New Testament priest back to Abraham, paid tithes to Melchizedek. So, this is the priesthood recorded for us to show us how Jesus becomes our great high priest, which is what tore the veil in the temple top to bottom, something that the Levites could never do themselves because they were too busy needing sacrifices for themselves. So then the question is, how is Jesus our great high priest when according to the law it would have been impossible for him to be a priest in the first place? Melchizedek. That's how he's qualified to be a high priest. Because you'll hear everybody say, well, it was impossible for him to be a high priest. Well, by the law, that's kind of correct. But that's because his priestly line predates the law. Actually, long predates, 5 centuries predates the law. Plus. All right, well, I could have slowed down just a hair. Any questions, comments on Melchizedek? And how Melchizedek as a type of Christ remains a continual priest forever? The lineage of Melchizedek? Anything? I'm so disappointed in my class. No questions? No comments? All right. Well, thank you all for your input. Look at that timing.